Most people talk about mommy issues, but very few talk about daddy issues in men and how silently destructive they can be. Because when a boy grows up without emotional guidance, he doesn't grow into a man, he grows into a man still searching for approval. This isn't about blaming fathers. This is about understanding why some men struggle with identity, intimacy, and emotional regulation, even when they look confident on the outside. Emotional absence doesn't look dramatic. There are no obvious scars, no loud fights, no visible abandonment. It's quiet. It's a father who is physically present but emotionally unreachable, a man who provides but never connects, who listens without hearing, who corrects without understanding. For a child, especially a boy, this absence creates confusion before it creates pain. He learns very early that his emotions do not land anywhere. Joy isn't mirrored, fear isn't soothed, sadness isn't held. Over time, the child stops expressing not because he is strong, but because he has learned that expression leads nowhere. This is where emotional hunger begins, not as a craving for attention, but as a deep, unspoken longing to be seen, chosen, and validated. The boy grows up believing love must be earned, approval must be chased, and worth must be proven. Emotional absence teaches him that connection is conditional, and this belief quietly becomes the foundation of his adult relationships. As he grows older, this emotional hunger doesn't disappear, it evolves. It shows up in how he attaches to people, how he handles rejection, and how desperately he needs affirmation without admitting it. He may become hyper-independent, convincing himself he needs no one, while internally craving reassurance he never received. Or he may become emotionally dependent, attaching quickly, fearing abandonment intensely, and reading small changes in tone as threats. The hunger created by emotional absence often pushes men to seek validation externally through achievement, status, sexual attention, or control. None of these satisfy the hunger because the hunger was never about success or desire. It was about emotional attunement. When that need goes unmet in childhood, the nervous system stays alert, constantly scanning for approval, constantly afraid of emotional withdrawal. This is why some men feel empty even when they are winning in life. The hunger is emotional, not circumstantial. In relationships, emotional hunger becomes particularly visible. A man who never felt emotionally held by his father may unconsciously expect his partner to fill that gap. He may seek excessive reassurance, struggle with emotional regulation, or feel deeply wounded by boundaries. When a partner pulls back even slightly, it doesn't feel like distance, it feels like abandonment. This is not immaturity, it is an old wound being activated. Emotional absence teaches a boy that love can disappear without explanation. So, as a man, he tries to secure love through intensity, control, or constant presence. At the same time, he may fear vulnerability because expressing emotional need once led to disappointment. This creates an internal conflict, a hunger for closeness paired with a fear of it. He wants intimacy but doesn't trust it. He wants connection but doesn't believe it will last. So he oscillates between craving and withdrawal, longing and defense, attachment and avoidance, never fully at ease, always managing the fear that if he is not enough, he will once again be emotionally left behind. Authority confusion begins when a boy has no stable reference point for what grounded leadership looks like. A father is often the first authority a child encounters, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of orientation. Through him, a boy learns how power is exercised, how decisions are made, how boundaries are held without fear, and how strength can coexist with calm. When that presence is inconsistent, passive, aggressive, or entirely absent, authority becomes something unclear and emotionally charged. The boy does not learn to respect authority. He learns to fear it, resent it, or overcompensate for it. Masculinity, instead of feeling embodied and and natural becomes performative. Without a healthy model, masculinity turns into something to prove rather than something to inhabit. The boy grows up unsure whether authority means dominance or responsibility, whether leadership requires emotional suppression, and whether strength must come at the cost of softness. As this confusion deepens, it creates gaps in masculine identity that surface in subtle but persistent ways. Some men grow up defiant toward authority, rejecting guidance, structure, and mentorship because authority feels threatening or unreliable. Others become excessively submissive, constantly seeking approval from figures they perceive as powerful, replicating the same imbalance they experienced in childhood. Both responses stem from the same root: the absence of a steady, respectful masculine presence that could demonstrate authority without intimidation. When a boy never sees authority exercised with integrity, he struggles to develop internal authority. Decision making becomes anxiety driven. Boundaries feel uncomfortable. Confidence feels fragile. Masculinity becomes reactive rather than rooted, swinging between arrogance and insecurity depending on the situation and the people involved. This gap also shows up in how men relate to responsibility and self discipline. A healthy masculine model teaches that responsibility is not punishment, but purpose. Without that example, responsibility can feel overwhelming, unfair, or emotionally heavy. Some men avoid commitment entirely, fearing they will fail at roles they were never prepared for. Others over-identify with responsibility, tying their entire self-worth to performance and productivity. In both cases, masculinity becomes conditional. The man feels valuable only when he is useful, impressive, or in control. Emotional expression is often neglected, not because he lacks emotions, but because he never saw strength paired with vulnerability. He may believe that acknowledging fear, doubt, or tenderness undermines his authority, even though true authority is strengthened by emotional awareness. In relationships and social dynamics, authority confusion often manifests as power struggles or emotional withdrawal. A man unsure of his own authority may attempt to assert dominance where it isn't needed, mistaking control for leadership. Alternatively, he may avoid conflict altogether, fearing confrontation because he associates authority with emotional chaos. Masculinity gaps create men who either speak too loudly or not at all, who either overcorrect or disappear. Without an internalized model of calm, respectful authority, interactions become charged with unspoken tension. The man is constantly negotiating his sense of self. Am I strong enough? Am I respected? Am I failing? Am I being challenged? Instead of simply being present. Masculinity in this state is not an integrated identity, but an ongoing performance shaped by fear, uncertainty, and the unresolved question of what it truly means to lead and stand firmly in one's own presence. Attachment styles are not developed through logic or choice. They are formed through repeated emotional experiences long before a child has language to understand them. In early childhood, the nervous system learns what to expect from connection. It learns whether comfort arrives when distress is expressed, whether emotional needs are met consistently, and whether closeness feels safe or unpredictable. When care is attuned and responsive, the child internalizes a sense of security that becomes the foundation for future relationships. When care is inconsistent, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable, the child adapts. These adaptations are not flaws, they are survival strategies. The child learns how to stay connected in the environment he is given, even if that environment does not provide stability. Over time, these early emotional patterns become automatic, shaping how the individual bonds, separates, trusts, and protects himself in adulthood. For boys raised with emotional inconsistency or absence, attachment often becomes organized around uncertainty. If affection is unpredictable, the child learns to stay hyper-aware of emotional shifts, becoming anxious and preoccupied with connection. If emotional expression is ignored or discouraged, the child learns to deactivate his needs, becoming avoidant and self-reliant on the surface. These patterns are not conscious decisions. They are embedded responses stored in the nervous system. As the boy grows into a man, his attachment style quietly influences how he experiences intimacy. Anxiously attached men may crave closeness intensely while fearing rejection, interpreting distance as abandonment and reassurance as temporary. Avoidantly attached men may value independence to the point of emotional isolation, pulling away when relationships deepen, not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers discomfort and loss of control. Both styles originate from early environments where emotional safety was uncertain or unavailable. In adult relationships, these early patterns are often misinterpreted as personality traits rather than learned responses. An avoidant man may be labeled emotionally cold, when in reality, he learned early that emotional reliance leads to disappointment. An anxious man may be seen as needy when, in reality, he learned that connection must be actively maintained to prevent loss. These attachment responses are not about the present partner. They are echoes of the past being replayed in new contexts. When emotional needs were unmet early on, the adult nervous system remains alert, scanning for signs of withdrawal, rejection, or inconsistency. Intimacy becomes both desired and threatening. The man wants connection, but his body remembers what connection once cost him emotionally. This creates internal conflict, where closeness triggers fear and distance triggers longing. Attachment styles also shape how men handle conflict, vulnerability, and emotional regulation. Those with insecure attachment may struggle to self-soothe, relying heavily on external validation or shutting down entirely when overwhelmed. Conflict may feel destabilizing rather than resolvable, activating deep fears of loss or exposure. Emotional expression can feel risky because in early life it may not have been met with understanding or care. Over time, these patterns become self-reinforcing as relationships repeat familiar dynamics, not because they are healthy, but because they are recognizable. The early attachment blueprint continues to influence how love is sought, how safety is defined, and how emotional bonds are formed long after the original environment has changed. Anger, ego, and people-pleasing are often misunderstood as personality flaws, when in reality they are emotional armor. They develop early as protective responses to environments where vulnerability did not feel safe. When a boy learns that expressing fear, sadness, or need leads to dismissal, punishment, or emotional distance, his nervous system adapts. Anger becomes a shield because it creates distance and restores a sense of power. Ego forms as a barrier, convincing him that self-importance will prevent humiliation or rejection. People-pleasing emerges as a strategy to secure safety through approval, ensuring that connection is maintained by being useful, agreeable, or non-threatening. These responses are not conscious choices. They are learned survival mechanisms that once served a purpose. The problem is not that they exist, but that they persist long after the original threat is gone. As these defenses harden over time, they begin to shape identity. Anger may become the primary emotional language, masking vulnerability with irritability, impatience, or control. The man feels strong in anger because it numbs fear and creates certainty, even if that certainty is destructive. Ego, on the other hand, creates an inflated sense of self that depends on superiority, success, or dominance. It offers temporary protection from shame, but requires constant reinforcement, making the man hypersensitive to criticism or perceived disrespect. People-pleasing operates in the opposite direction, but from the same wound. Instead of asserting power, the man erases himself to avoid conflict or abandonment. He prioritizes others' needs while suppressing his own, believing that being liked is safer than being authentic. Each of these defenses reduces emotional exposure, but at the cost of genuine connection. In relationships, these mechanisms create predictable yet painful patterns. Anger pushes people away while demanding closeness on the man's terms. Ego attracts admiration but blocks intimacy because vulnerability threatens the carefully constructed image. People-pleasing builds proximity but breeds resentment, as unspoken needs remain unmet. Partners often feel confused, sensing emotional distance beneath intense reactions or excessive accommodation. The man himself may feel misunderstood, unaware that his defenses are preventing the very connection he longs for. These patterns are self-reinforcing. Anger leads to conflict, confirming the belief that closeness is unsafe. Ego invites comparison and competition, reinforcing insecurity. People-pleasing invites imbalance, confirming the belief that one's needs do not matter. Over time, these defenses limit emotional growth. They keep the man oriented toward protection rather than presence, reaction rather than reflection. Emotional energy is spent maintaining armor instead of developing self-awareness. The nervous system remains on alert, interpreting neutral interactions as threats and responding automatically. What once kept the boy safe now keeps the man stuck, repeating patterns that no longer serve him. Anger, ego, and people-pleasing are not the problem themselves. They are signals pointing to unmet needs, unresolved fear, and unprocessed pain. When these defenses are seen not as identity, but as information, they reveal the underlying vulnerability they were designed to protect, offering insight into how deeply the past continues to influence emotional behavior. When validation from a father is missing, a boy does not stop needing validation. He simply looks for it elsewhere. A father's affirmation is not just praise, it is orientation. It tells a boy that he is seen, capable, and worthy without having to perform for it. When that affirmation is absent or inconsistent, the boy grows up with an unresolved question about his value. As he enters adolescence and adulthood, that question often gets redirected toward women. Female attention, approval, and desire begin to serve as substitutes for paternal validation, not because women are meant to play that role, but because they become the most emotionally available source of affirmation. The man may not consciously connect his need for reassurance to his father wound, yet the pattern quietly shapes how he approaches attraction, intimacy, and self-worth. This substitution often creates a fragile sense of identity. A man who relies on validation from women may feel confident only when he is desired, admired, or needed. His self-esteem becomes externally regulated, rising and falling with attention and approval. Romantic interest feels intoxicating, not simply because of attraction, but because it temporarily fills an emotional gap that has existed for years. Rejection, indifference, or emotional distance, however, feels disproportionately painful. It does not register as a normal relational experience. It feels like confirmation of inadequacy. This is why some men become preoccupied with being chosen, pursuing validation through charm, success, or sexual conquest, believing that being wanted equates to being worthy. The pursuit is rarely about connection. It is about reassurance. In relationships, this dynamic places an unspoken burden on women. When a partner becomes the primary source of validation, she is unconsciously expected to regulate the man's self-worth. Her attention becomes emotional fuel, and her withdrawal, even when healthy or necessary, can trigger insecurity or resentment. The man may seek constant affirmation, struggle with jealousy, or fear independence in his partner because her autonomy threatens his emotional stability. Alternatively, he may detach once validation is secured, losing interest after the initial reassurance fades because the underlying hunger remains unaddressed. In both cases, intimacy becomes distorted. The relationship is no longer about mutual connection, but about emotional compensation. This pattern also affects how men relate to masculinity and power. Without paternal validation, some men equate worth with desirability, confusing being wanted with being respected. They may prioritize external image over internal integrity, shaping their behavior around what attracts approval rather than what reflects their values. Emotional expression can become performative, offered strategically to maintain validation rather than as genuine vulnerability. Over time, this reliance on external affirmation limits emotional growth. The man remains dependent on feedback rather than grounded in self-trust. His sense of self feels unstable because it was never anchored internally. Validation from women, no matter how frequent or intense, cannot replace the stabilizing function of paternal affirmation because it addresses the symptom rather than the source. The hunger persists beneath the attention, quietly influencing choices, relationships, and the way love is pursued. Healing does not begin with pointing fingers, recounting what was missing, or replaying the ways someone failed you. Those realizations may bring clarity, but clarity alone does not create change. Accountability is the moment a man recognizes that while he did not choose his early wounds, he is now responsible for how they shape his behavior, his relationships, and his emotional patterns. Blame keeps the nervous system locked in the past, anchored to what should have been different. Accountability shifts focus to the present, where agency exists. It asks a different question, not why did this happen to me, but how is this affecting the way I live, love, and lead now? That shift is uncomfortable because it removes the safety of victimhood and replaces it with responsibility, but it is the only place where healing becomes possible. Blame often feels justified, especially when pain was real and neglect was genuine, yet blame subtly reinforces powerlessness. When a man defines his struggles solely through the failures of his father, he remains psychologically tied to him. His emotions, reactions, and relational patterns continue to orbit around an unresolved past. Accountability, by contrast, does not deny the harm. It acknowledges it fully while refusing to let it dictate the future. It means recognizing how unmet needs became coping strategies, how emotional absence shaped attachment, and how survival patterns now create problems rather than protection. This awareness requires honesty without self-punishment. Accountability is not self-attack, it is self-observation. It is the ability to say, this makes sense given what I lived through, and it is still my responsibility to address it. In relationships, accountability changes the entire dynamic. Instead of expecting partners to compensate for old wounds, the man begins to notice when emotional reactions are disproportionate, when fear is older than the situation, and when validation is being sought rather than connection. He learns to pause rather than react, to self-soothe rather than demand reassurance, and to communicate needs without entitlement. This does not happen through willpower alone. It requires patience, reflection, and often discomfort because accountability exposes patterns that once felt necessary for survival. Yet this exposure is precisely what creates freedom. The man is no longer driven by unconscious needs. He becomes aware of them and can choose differently. Accountability also reshapes masculinity from something defensive into something integrated. instead of using anger, withdrawal, or control to protect unhealed pain. The man develops emotional literacy and internal authority. He learns that strength is not proven by denial, but by presence, not by dominance, but by self-regulation. Healing becomes an active process rather than a passive expectation that someone else will fix what was broken. The past no longer serves as an excuse or a shield. It becomes context. Accountability transforms wounds into information rather than identity, allowing the man to build a sense of self rooted in choice rather than reaction, awareness rather than repetition, responsibility rather than resentment. All of this points to one central truth: what is left unexamined does not disappear. It quietly shapes the life a man lives. Emotional absence, authority confusion, insecure attachment, and the search for validation are not isolated traits. They are interconnected responses to early experiences that were never fully processed. When these patterns remain unconscious, they replay themselves in relationships, in self-image, and in the way a man relates to power, intimacy, and purpose. Awareness is not about labeling wounds. It is about recognizing how deeply they influence choices that feel personal but are often patterned. The moment a man understands this, he stops seeing his struggles as personal failures and starts seeing them as signals asking for attention. Healing is not about becoming someone new, but about reclaiming parts of the self that were never allowed to develop fully. When responsibility replaces blame, emotional hunger loses its grip, attachment becomes more secure, and validation no longer has to be borrowed from others. The need to perform masculinity softens into the ability to embody it with calm and integrity. This process is neither quick nor linear, but it is transformative. A man who does this work no longer seeks to be completed by others, nor defined by what he lacked. He becomes anchored in self-awareness, capable of intimacy without fear, leadership without control, and strength without emotional disconnection. This is where maturity begins, not in perfection, but in the courage to face what shaped you and choose how it will shape you going forward.